The gunshot echoed across the dusty main street of Silver Creek, shattering the peaceful afternoon like a hammer on glass. Pearl Kingston ducked instinctively behind a water trough, her heart pounding against her ribs as the outlaw's bullets splintered the wood around her. She never saw Dustin Lawson move. One moment, he was lounging against the hitching post outside the general store, and the next he was diving through the air, his body intercepting the barrage of bullets meant for her. "Dustin!" Pearl screamed as he crumpled to the dirt, red blooming across his white shirt. The outlaws, 3 men on horseback with bandanas pulled over their faces, were already spurring their mounts down the street, disappearing around the bend. But Pearl couldn't spare them a thought, not with Dustin bleeding in the dirt. She crawled to him, heedless of the danger or the dirt soaking into her dress. "Someone help!" she cried, pressing her hands against his wounds. "Please, someone." It was 1876, and Silver Creek, Colorado, was barely more than a collection of wooden buildings and hope. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in the kindness of its residents. Doc Miller came running from his office, and together they carried Dustin's unconscious form across the street. "He took 3 bullets," the doctor said grimly, cutting away Dustin's shirt. "One's in his shoulder, one grazed his side. But this one in his chest," he shook his head. "Don't you say it," Pearl whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare say he won't make it. I don't know a man alive who'd take bullets for a woman he barely knows." Doc Miller replied, not unkindly. "He must think mighty highly of you, Miss Kingston." Pearl stared down at Dustin's pale face. They'd only exchanged pleasantries since she'd arrived in town 3 weeks ago to take over the schoolhouse. He tipped his hat when they passed on the street. He'd helped carry her trunk to her rented room above the millinery. Once, he'd handed her a wildflower he'd picked while riding in from his ranch, saying only, "Reminded me of your eyes," before walking away. And now he lay dying because of her. "Tell me what to do," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "I won't let him die for me." Through the night, Pearl stayed by Dustin's side, following Doc Miller's instructions with steady hands despite her racing heart. She bathed his fevered brow, changed his bandages, and prayed like she'd never prayed before. As dawn broke, painting the small room in golden light, Dustin's eyes fluttered open. "Are you an angel?" he whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Far from it," Pearl replied, relief making her voice tremble. "I'm the fool you nearly died saving." A weak smile curved his lips. "Then I'd say, I made the right choice." His eyes closed again, but his breathing was steadier now. Doc Miller returned, checking Dustin's wounds and pulse. "He's stronger than I thought," he admitted. "The bullet in his chest missed his heart by less than an inch. If he doesn't develop a fever from infection, he might just pull through." "He will," Pearl said with conviction. "I'll make sure of it." Over the next week, Pearl barely left Dustin's bedside. She arranged for another woman to handle her teaching duties and devoted herself to his recovery. She learned the contours of his face, the sound of his breathing, the feel of his calloused hand in hers. On the 7th day, when Dustin was strong enough to sit up and take broth, Sheriff Thomas arrived. "I've got news," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "Those men who shot you, they weren't just random outlaws. They were Fletcher's men." Dustin's face hardened. "Franklin Fletcher?" The sheriff nodded. "And they weren't aiming for you, son. They were gunning for Miss Kingston here." Pearl felt the blood drain from her face. "Me? But why would anyone want to harm me?" Sheriff Thomas sighed. "I did some asking around. Seems Fletcher's taken over the Thompson mine north of here. And the land he wants next, well, it's that parcel your father left you. The one with the stream running through it. My father's land." Pearl shook her head in confusion. "It's just a small homestead. I haven't even seen it yet." "Water rights," Dustin said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "In this country, clean water's worth more than gold. If Fletcher controls your stream, he controls every ranch and farm for 20 miles. Pearl sat heavily in the chair beside his bed. "So those men, they were trying to kill me to get my land." "Fletcher's not known for negotiating," the sheriff said grimly. "And with you being a woman alone, he probably figured it would be easier to eliminate you and forge some paperwork than to make you an offer." Dustin's hand found hers, squeezing with surprising strength. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his blue eyes intense. "Fletcher will have to go through me to get to you." "He nearly did," Pearl reminded him. And I'm still here, Dustin countered. Next time, I'll be ready. As Dustin recovered, Pearl learned more about him. He'd come west after the war, unable to settle back into his family's shipping business in Boston after what he'd seen on the battlefield. He'd built his ranch from nothing, raising cattle and breaking horses with a quiet competence that had earned him the respect of everyone in the territory. "Why did you do it?" she asked him one evening as they sat on Doc Miller's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. Dustin was still weak, but improving daily. "Jump in front of those bullets, I mean." He was silent so long she thought he might not answer. "Then, I saw my mother die when I was 12, he said softly. "Runaway carriage on a Boston street. I was too far away to help. Just had to watch it happen." His eyes, when they met hers, held a pain that made her breath catch. "I promised myself I'd never stand by again if I could help. And then I saw those men aim at you, and I just moved." Pearl touched his hand gently. "Thank you, though I still think it was foolish." "Probably," he agreed with a small smile. "But I'd do it again in a heartbeat." 2 weeks after the shooting, Dustin insisted on returning to his ranch. "I've imposed on Doc Miller long enough," he said, though he was still pale and moved stiffly. "Then I'll come with you," Pearl decided. "You need someone to look after you, and I'm not returning to the schoolhouse until I know Fletcher won't try again." Dustin's ranch was modest but well kept, with a sturdy 2-room cabin, a barn, and corrals for his horses. His foreman, an older man named Hank, greeted them with obvious relief. "Thank the Lord you're back," he said, helping Dustin down from the wagon. "We were starting to think we'd have to run this place without you." "It'll take more than a few bullets to keep me down," Dustin replied, though Pearl noticed how he leaned on his friend's shoulder. That night, after getting Dustin settled in his room, Pearl sat at his small kitchen table, writing a letter to the land office inquiring about her father's property. She'd been so focused on establishing herself as the town's teacher that she hadn't given much thought to the land he'd left her when he died the previous year. A noise at the door made her look up. Dustin stood there, leaning against the frame. "You should be resting," she scolded. "I've been lying down for 2 weeks, he countered. "Any more rest, and I'll take root." He eased himself into a chair across from her. "What are you writing?" She told him about her letter, and he nodded thoughtfully. "Good. But Fletcher won't wait for legal proceedings. He'll try again." "What should I do?" "See your land," he said simply. "Know what you're fighting for, and then we'll figure out how to protect it, and you." The next day, despite Pearl's protest that he wasn't strong enough, Dustin saddled 2 horses. "It's only a few miles," he assured her, "and I need to be in the saddle again before I forget how." The ride was slow, with frequent stops for Dustin to rest, but Pearl couldn't deny the thrill of seeing the countryside. The golden plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with pine trees and wildflowers. And then, cresting a rise, Pearl saw a small valley, verdant with grass, through which a clear stream meandered. "Oh," she breathed, reining in her horse. "It's beautiful." Dustin nodded. "Your father chose well. This is good land." They rode down into the valley, where the remains of a small cabin stood beside the stream. It had been partially burned, and Pearl felt a pang of sadness, knowing her father had died before he could properly establish his home. "This is where the stream enters your property," Dustin explained, pointing upstream. "It continues through the valley and eventually joins the creek that runs through my land and several others. If Fletcher dams it up or diverts it, everyone downstream suffers." Pearl finished. "I understand now." They dismounted by the stream, and Pearl knelt to trail her fingers through the cool, clear water. "What am I going to do, Dustin? I can't fight a man like Fletcher." "Not alone," he agreed, lowering himself carefully to sit beside her. "But you're not alone." She looked at him, this man who had already risked everything for her. "Why do you care so much?" "About me, about this land." His eyes, blue as the Colorado sky, held hers steadily. "Because from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, with your books and your dreams of teaching, I knew you were someone worth caring about. And because men like Fletcher have been taking what isn't theirs for too long." Something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. On impulse, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle kiss that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her entire body. When she pulled back, Dustin's eyes had widened in surprise. Then he smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face. If that's my reward for getting shot, I might have to make a habit of it. Pearl laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Don't you dare. They spent the afternoon exploring the boundaries of Pearl's land, with Dustin pointing out its features and potential. The burned cabin could be rebuilt, he told her. The soil was rich enough for crops, and the higher ground would be perfect for grazing a small herd. You've thought about this, she observed as they rested in the shade of a large oak tree. I have, he admitted. I pass by here sometimes on my way to town. Always thought it was a shame no one was working this land after your father died. Pearl studied him. And now, he met her eyes. Now I'm thinking it would be a shame if anything happened to the woman who owns it. That evening, back at Dustin's ranch, they formulated a plan. Pearl would file her claim at the land office in Denver, establishing her legal ownership beyond question. Meanwhile, Dustin and some trusted men would begin rebuilding the cabin on her property not just as a homestead, but as a statement that the land was occupied and defended. Fletcher won't give up easily, Dustin warned as they sat by his fireplace. He's used to getting his way. Pearl's chin lifted. So am I, Mr. Lawson. I didn't come west to be intimidated by bullies. He chuckled. I'm beginning to see that. The next few days fell into a pattern. During the day, while Dustin continued to recover his strength, Pearl divided her time between teaching at the schoolhouse and learning about ranch operations. In the evenings, they sat together, planning the reconstruction of her cabin and strategies for dealing with Fletcher. A week after their visit to her land, Sheriff Thomas rode out to Dustin's ranch with news. Fletcher's men have been asking about you in town, he told Pearl. Saying you're squatting on land that rightfully belongs to the mining company. That's nonsense, Pearl replied hotly. I have my father's deed. I know that, the sheriff said. But legal claims take time to process. Meanwhile, Fletcher's got money and men. I'm worried about what he might try next. Dustin, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, spoke up. Then we won't wait. Pearl's deed is in order. We'll start rebuilding her cabin tomorrow, and I'll have men watching the property around the clock. You're still healing, Pearl protested. I can swing a hammer, he insisted. And the sooner we establish your presence on that land, the harder it will be for Fletcher to claim it's abandoned. The next morning, a wagon loaded with lumber and supplies set out for Pearl's property, followed by Dustin, Pearl, and half a dozen ranch hands. They worked through the day, clearing the burned ruins and laying the foundation for a new cabin. Pearl, who had insisted on helping despite Dustin's concern that it wasn't women's work, was placing stones for the fireplace when she noticed riders approaching from the north. Dustin, she called, standing and shading her eyes. He was at her side instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. The four men rode directly to the building site, stopping a few yards away. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, surveyed the scene with obvious displeasure. You're trespassing, he said without preamble. This land belongs to the Thompson Mining Company. You're mistaken, Pearl replied, stepping forward despite Dustin's protective hand on her arm. This land belonged to my father, James Kingston, and now it belongs to me. I have the deed. The man sneered. A piece of paper doesn't mean much out here, madam. Mr. Fletcher has plans for this valley, and they don't include a schoolteacher playing at being a homesteader. That's enough, Roberts, Dustin said, his voice cold. Miss Kingston's claim is legitimate. You tell Fletcher if he has concerns, he can address them through the proper legal channels. Roberts's eyes narrowed as he recognized Dustin. Thought we'd taken care of you, Lawson. Guess we'll have to be more thorough next time. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Dustin's ranch hands had moved closer, hands near their weapons. Is that what you want? Dustin asked quietly. A war? Because that's what you'll get if you push this. For a tense moment, Pearl thought violence would erupt right there. Then Roberts spat on the ground and reined his horse around. This isn't over, he called over his shoulder as the men rode away. That night, they posted guards around the property and continued working by lantern light. Pearl found Dustin sitting alone by the newly built fireplace, staring into the flames. You should get some rest, she said softly, sitting beside him. I was thinking about what Roberts said. He replied, not looking up. About starting a war. Do you think they'll really attack us? Dustin nodded slowly. Fletcher didn't get where he is by backing down, and he has more men than we do. Pearl felt fear curl in her stomach, but pushed it aside. Then we'll need help. Surely the people in town, most of them are too afraid of Fletcher, Dustin interrupted. But there are others who've had land stolen or water rights threatened. Ranchers, farmers. If we can unite them, then we stand a chance, Pearl finished. He finally looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. It won't be easy, and it will be dangerous. She took his hand, feeling the calluses and strength in his fingers. Nothing worth fighting for is ever easy. The next day, Dustin sent riders to neighboring ranches while work continued on the cabin. By evening, the main structure was complete enough to provide shelter, though it still lacked windows and proper furnishings. As the sun set, riders began arriving, not just the messengers Dustin had sent, but the ranchers themselves, along with their own men. They gathered around a large bonfire, solemn-faced men who'd carved lives out of the wilderness and weren't about to let someone take what they'd built. Dustin stood before them, his tall figure silhouetted against the flames. Fletcher wants more than just Miss Kingston's land, he told them. He wants control of the water that feeds all our properties. Today it's her stream. Tomorrow it could be any of yours. An older rancher named Samuel Burke spoke up. Fletcher's threatened my northern pasture for months. Says my cattle are damaging potential mining land. Others joined in, sharing similar stories. Fletcher had been systematically pressuring small landowners throughout the region, using threats, legal maneuvers, and occasionally violence to expand his holdings. So what do we do? Someone asked. We can't fight the kind of money he has. Maybe not, Dustin agreed. But we can stand together. Make it too costly for him to push us out one by one. By the end of the meeting, a plan had formed. The ranchers would take turns sending men to help guard Pearl's property while the cabin was completed. They would also form patrols to watch their own lands and alert others if Fletcher's men were spotted. As the ranchers departed, promising to return with more men and supplies, Pearl touched Dustin's arm. You're building an army, she said quietly. I'm building a community, he corrected her. Something Fletcher doesn't understand. They slept in the partially completed cabin that night. Pearl on a makeshift bed near the fireplace, Dustin on a bedroll by the door, his revolver close at hand. Despite the hard floor and the cool night air seeping through the unfinished walls, Pearl felt safer than she had since the shooting in town. The next morning brought more helpers, including several women from neighboring ranches who helped Pearl establish a proper cooking area and begin planting a small garden. By midday, the cabin had windows and a proper door, and work had begun on furnishings. Pearl was hanging curtains made from fabric donated by the general store when she heard a commotion outside. She stepped onto the porch to see a cloud of dust approaching from the north, a large group of riders, at least 20 men. Dustin, she called, fear tightening her throat. He was already striding toward her, rifle in hand. Get inside, he ordered, his voice tense. And stay away from the windows. But Pearl didn't move. This is my land, she said firmly. I won't hide. Dustin looked as though he wanted to argue, but the riders were nearly upon them. Their own men, about 15 ranchers and hands, formed a line in front of the cabin, weapons ready, but not yet raised. The approaching group slowed, and Pearl recognized Roberts at their head. Beside him rode a well-dressed man on a magnificent black horse, Franklin Fletcher himself, she assumed. He was older than she'd expected, with silver at his temples and a neatly trimmed beard, looking more like a banker than a ruthless land grabber. Fletcher reined in his horse and surveyed the scene with cold eyes. Quite the reception committee, Mr. Lawson, he remarked, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. All this for little old me. Your reputation precedes you, Dustin replied evenly. What do you want, Fletcher? The older man smiled thinly. Just to speak with the lady of the house. I believe we have business to discuss. Pearl stepped forward, ignoring Dustin's warning glance. Any business between us can be conducted right here, Mr. Fletcher. Fletcher removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Miss Kingston, I presume? I'm sorry we haven't been properly introduced. Perhaps if your watchdog hadn't interfered in town, we could have had a civilized conversation before now. Your men tried to kill me, Pearl said bluntly. I don't call that civilized. A regrettable misunderstanding, Fletcher said, his smile never wavering. My men were overzealous. I merely wished to discuss purchasing your property, which I'm prepared to do most generously. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. $10,000, Miss Kingston. Far more than this piece of land is worth. Murmurs ran through the gathered men. It was indeed a generous sum, enough to set Pearl up comfortably anywhere else. The land isn't for sale, Pearl said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Fletcher's smile tightened. Everyone has a price, Miss Kingston. Name yours. She already gave you her answer. Dustin cut in. And now I suggest you leave. Fletcher's eyes hardened as they shifted to Dustin. You're making a mistake, Lawson. Both of you are. This doesn't have to end badly. Yet you brought 20 armed men to a peaceful negotiation, Dustin observed. Insurance, Fletcher replied smoothly. This territory can be dangerous for a man traveling alone. His gaze returned to Pearl. Think about my offer, Miss Kingston. It won't remain open indefinitely. With that, he replaced his hat, nodded curtly, and turned his horse. His men followed, casting dark looks at the defenders as they departed. As the dust settled, Pearl realized she was trembling. Dustin's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her. You did well, he said quietly. He'll be back, she replied. Yes, Dustin agreed. But next time, we'll be even better prepared. Over the next few days, the cabin was completed and properly furnished. Pearl officially moved in, though Dustin and at least 4 other men remained on the property at all times. They dug a well, built a small stable, and started fencing the area immediately around the cabin. Word came from town that Fletcher had increased the number of armed men at the mining camp, and rumors spread that he was bringing in professional gunmen from Denver. Sheriff Thomas rode out to warn them, looking increasingly worried. I can't protect you out here, he told Pearl frankly. My jurisdiction only extends to the town limits, and even there, Fletcher has half the council in his pocket. We understand, Dustin replied. We're not asking you to take sides, Sheriff. The lawman's side. Maybe not, but sides are being taken all the same. Half the town thinks you're fools for standing up to Fletcher. The other half is secretly hoping you succeed. He paused. Just be careful. Fletcher's not known for his patience. After the sheriff left, Pearl found Dustin checking the ammunition supply in the small storeroom they'd built. Do you think we're fools? She asked quietly. He looked up, his face solemn in the dim light. Do you regret staying to fight? She considered the question seriously. No, she finally said. This land was my father's dream. And now it's become something more, a symbol of standing against men like Fletcher who think they can take whatever they want. Dustin nodded, a small smile touching his lips. Then we're not fools. Stubborn, maybe. Possibly reckless. But not fools. Pearl stepped closer, drawn by something in his expression. And what about you? This isn't your fight. Not really. You could walk away. Is that what you want? No, she admitted softly. I want you to stay. I just don't understand why you would. He set down the ammunition box and stood, closing the distance between them. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite their strength. I think you do understand, he said, his voice low. You just want to hear me say it. Pearl's heart raced as she met his gaze. Say it then. I love you, he said simply. I think I have since I first saw you, standing in the dusty street with your books and your determined expression. I would have spent months working up the courage to court you properly if those outlaws hadn't forced my hand. A smile bloomed on Pearl's face. Then I suppose I should be grateful to them, in a way. She rose on tiptoe, bringing her lips to his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened, expressing all the feelings that had been building between them. When they finally broke apart, Dustin rested his forehead against hers. When this is over, he promised, I'll court you properly. Dinner in town, dances, the works. I'll hold you to that, she whispered. The attack came at dawn 3 days later. Pearl was awakened by shouts and the crack of a rifle shot. She scrambled into her clothes and rushed to the window to see Fletcher's men advancing across the open ground toward the cabin, using the early morning shadows for cover. Dustin burst into the room, his expression grim. Stay down, he ordered, handing her a shotgun. Use this if anyone gets past us. Then he was gone, joining the defenders who had taken positions around the cabin and behind the half-built fence. Gunfire erupted in earnest, and Pearl fought the urge to cower. Instead, she moved carefully from window to window, watching the battle unfold. Fletcher's men outnumbered them, but the defenders had the advantage of cover and preparation. Still, they were being pushed back steadily toward the cabin. Pearl saw one of their men fall, clutching his leg, before being dragged to safety by his companions. She could make out Roberts directing the attack from behind a large boulder. Of Fletcher himself, there was no sign the coward had sent his men to do his dirty work, she realized bitterly. A bullet shattered the window near her, sending glass flying. Pearl ducked instinctively, then raised the shotgun, ready to defend herself if necessary. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, just as Fletcher's men seemed poised to rush the cabin itself, a new sound cut through the gunfire, whooping yells from the east. Pearl risked a glance out the window to see a dozen riders galloping toward the battle, rifles raised. It was Samuel Burke and men from the neighboring ranches, coming to their aid. The sight of reinforcements seemed to break the attackers' resolve. They began pulling back, firing covering shots as they retreated. The defenders pressed their advantage, forcing Fletcher's men into a full retreat. Pearl watched as Dustin led a charge that sent the last of the attackers fleeing toward the northern ridge. When the gunfire finally stopped, Pearl rushed outside. The air was thick with gun smoke, and several men were wounded, though none fatally from what she could see. She searched frantically for Dustin, finally spotting him helping a fallen man to his feet. "Dustin," she called, running toward him. He turned, his face lighting up at the sight of her. But as he stepped toward her, a movement on the ridge caught Pearl's eye. A lone figure rose from behind a rock, rifle aimed directly at Dustin's back. "Down!" Pearl screamed, raising her shotgun instinctively. Dustin dropped just as she fired. The blast echoed across the valley, and the figure on the ridge jerked backward, tumbling out of sight. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then the defenders were moving again, securing the area and tending to the wounded. Dustin reached Pearl in 3 long strides, taking the shotgun from her shaking hands. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She had shot a man, possibly killed him. Dustin seemed to understand. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she trembled. "It's all right," he murmured against her hair. "You did what you had to do." "I didn't think," she whispered. "I just saw him aiming at you, and you saved my life," he finished for her. "Just like I saved yours in town. Makes us even, I'd say." Despite everything, a small laugh escaped her. "I suppose it does." The aftermath of the battle was a flurry of activity. The wounded were treated, the property secured, and riders sent to town to inform Sheriff Thomas of what had happened. To everyone's surprise, the man Pearl had shot wasn't dead. He'd been wounded in the shoulder and captured by Burke's men as he tried to flee. It was Roberts, Fletcher's right-hand man. They kept him under guard in the barn, where Doc Miller, who had ridden out with medical supplies, treated his wound. "He'll live," the doctor reported. "Though he might not thank you for that once the law gets involved." Sheriff Thomas arrived by mid-afternoon, looking grim but determined. "This has gone far enough," he said, surveying the bullet-riddled cabin. "Fletcher's crossed the line from land disputes into outright attempted murder." "Will you arrest him?" Pearl asked. The sheriff hesitated. "It won't be easy. He has influence." "He has Roberts," Dustin pointed out. "And Roberts might be willing to testify against his boss to save his own neck." Sheriff Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "It's a start." Over the next week, an uneasy peace settled over the valley. Fletcher made no further moves against Pearl's land, but neither did he surrender to the authorities. Roberts, facing charges of attempted murder, had indeed turned on his employer, providing detailed accounts of Fletcher's illegal activities. Pearl threw herself into restoring what had been damaged in the attack. The cabin needed repairs, and the garden she'd started had been trampled. Dustin was by her side constantly, helping with the work and ensuring she was protected. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Pearl asked the question that had been on her mind. What happens now? Even if Fletcher is arrested, will it ever really be over? Dustin took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Nothing's ever completely over out here, but we've shown that we won't be pushed around. That counts for something." Pearl leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined my life would turn out like this when I came west to teach." "Regrets?" he asked softly. "Not one," she assured him, tilting her face up to his. "How could I regret finding you?" The kiss they shared was tender, full of promise for the future. 2 days later, the news arrived. Franklin Fletcher had been arrested in Denver while attempting to flee the territory. With Roberts's testimony and evidence gathered by the territorial marshal, he faced charges that would likely see him imprisoned for years. The ranchers gathered at Pearl's homestead to celebrate, bringing food, drink, and music. As the sun set, turning the sky to gold and crimson, Dustin led Pearl away from the festivities to the small bench they'd built beside the stream. "I have something to ask you," he said, his usual confidence giving way to nervousness. Pearl's heart skipped a beat as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "I carved this," he said, opening it to reveal a ring with a small but perfect diamond. "The ring was my mother's. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right woman to give it to." He knelt before her, his blue eyes earnest in the fading light. "Pearl Kingston, I love you more than I ever thought possible. Will you marry me?" Tears of happiness blurred Pearl's vision. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married a month later in the small church in Silver Creek. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, along with ranchers and farmers from miles around. Even Sheriff Thomas was there, looking pleased with himself now that Fletcher was safely behind bars awaiting trial. After the ceremony, Dustin surprised Pearl by leading her to a wagon laden with their belongings. "Where are we going?" she asked, laughing as he lifted her onto the seat. "Home," he replied simply. "Our home." He drove her to her land, their land now, where the cabin stood transformed. While she had been staying in town preparing for the wedding, Dustin and his men had been working in secret. The cabin had been expanded, with a proper bedroom added, the interior finished with polished wood and comfortable furnishings. A white picket fence surrounded a garden planted with vegetables and flowers. "It's perfect," Pearl breathed as he carried her across the threshold. "Not quite," Dustin said, setting her down gently. "A home needs more than just walls and a roof. It needs love and dreams and a future." "It has all of those now," she assured him, drawing his face down for a kiss. That night, as they lay together in their new bed, Pearl traced the scars on Dustin's chest, permanent reminders of the bullets he had taken for her. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been so foolishly brave that day?" He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I wasn't being brave. I was protecting something precious, even if I didn't fully understand why at the time." And now, his smile was tender in the moonlight that filtered through the window. "Now I know exactly what I was fighting for. Not just you, but this us, together. A future. A family." Pearl nestled closer to him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "A family," she echoed softly. "I like the sound of that." In the years that followed, the valley thrived. Pearl continued teaching at the schoolhouse in town, riding in each day on a mare Dustin had trained especially for her. Dustin expanded his ranch operations to include Pearl's land, raising cattle and horses that became known throughout the territory for their quality. The stream that Fletcher had coveted became a blessing for the entire community, as Dustin worked with neighboring ranchers to develop a fair water-sharing system that benefited everyone. The bullet-scarred cabin grew into a proper ranch house as their family expanded, first with the birth of their son, James, named after Pearl's father, and then their daughter, Elizabeth. On warm summer evenings, they would often sit on their porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. Dustin would pull Pearl close, his arm around her shoulders, and they would speak of their good fortune, not the prosperous ranch or the respect they had earned, but the love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if those outlaws had never fired at me that day?" Pearl asked once, as they celebrated their 5th anniversary. Dustin considered the question, his eyes following their children as they chased fireflies in the twilight. "I believe we would have found our way to each other eventually," he said. "Though perhaps with fewer scars." Pearl smiled, touching the faded marks on his chest that she knew by heart. "I wouldn't change a thing," she said softly. "Not one moment of our story." "Nor would I," Dustin agreed, kissing her with the same tenderness he had shown from the beginning. Every bullet was worth it. And as darkness fell across the valley they had fought for and won, the stars emerged one by one, witnesses to a love that had been forged in fire and blood, but had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring, a love as vast as the western sky and as steadfast as the mountains that guarded their home.